I'm Paul Kennedy, and this is Ideas, with Part 2 of Dante, Poet of the Impossible. He was born a son of medieval Florence, became an exile from it in 1302, when he was driven from the city on pain of death by his enemies. He was a politician in his time, an ambassador, his own theologian. But above all, he was a poet. There's a concept Dante would have recognized that helps explain his singular place in Western literature: authority. Literary critic Harold Bloom.
Authority is a Roman concept, and it means a founder. And authority, or author as we say now, is an originator, is a founder. It means going back to the foundation. And Dante is refounding Western poetry. He is doing what no one before him had been able to do. He is taking the vernacular and writing in the vernacular, and by choosing his own vernacular, the Florentine, he makes Tuscan the dialect, which since has become normative Italian. He is redefining the identity of poet and person in a way that had never existed in classical literature, not even in Latin poetry. He simply asserts it.
The daring of this act of authorial assertion, claiming ground where there was none before, cannot be overestimated. In the Middle Ages, the vernacular had no prestige, no cultural weight, until Dante came along. He used the vernacular in the Vita Nuova, his very first work, his little book, as he called it, of love poems. And he used it in the most important of his last works, a vast and dauntingly original poem, the Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy. Dante translator and scholar Robert Hollander.
It is a magnificent poem, and everyone who touched it from the very beginning realized they hadn't seen anything like this. This was the greatest thing written, at least in the Italian vernacular, and everybody realized that. It's just a poem that takes people away from themselves. They realize they're dealing with greatness, and that's why we've all made such an enormous fuss over it. And, it's one of the most amazing stories that we have in the history of literature, and eventually it's not explicable, how he ever got the idea to do this. At one point I've speculated if I walked into a publisher's office and say, I've got this great idea for a poem. I'm going to go to the other world. Saucers would be small to describe the eyes of said publisher.
This Ideas series is about the poet and his inexplicable poem, the Divine Comedy, in which Dante casts himself as a hero on a journey down into hell, up through purgatory, and finally into heaven. Begun in anger at his circumstance of exile, he turns his life into an apocalyptic narrative. In the first program of this series, we left the poet and Virgil, his guide, climbing their way out of the depths of the inferno. They've passed safely through 9 concentric circles of hell, devoted to the souls of the damned, each with its own landscape. When they reach the frozen lake at the bottom, the way out proves to be literally on Satan's body. And so they climb, hand over hand, with Virgil holding onto the tufts of Satan's hair, and Dante holding onto Virgil. At last, they're out on the earth in the dawn's light. Program 2, in which we navigate the Purgatorio.
Percorrer miglior acque alza le vele, omai la navicella del mio ingegno, che lascia dietro a sé mar sì crudele. To course on better waters, the little boat of my wit, that leaves behind her so cruel a sea, now raises her sails, And I will sing of that second kingdom in which the human spirit is made clean and becomes worthy to ascend to heaven.
That's how Book 2 begins, in the translation of poet William Merwin.
The part of the poem that is most beautiful and most moving to me has always been the Purgatorio. And it's not the most theatrical. The Inferno is the most theatrical. But it's most dramatic in that you see this mixture of anguish and hope. Of course, it's the only part of the poem in which there is any hope. There is no hope in hell, as you're told right at the beginning. And it's also the one that takes place with people walking on earth, actually on the earth, in the hours of the day.
Writer-broadcaster Greg Kelly.
When he was writing the Purgatorio, the dark night of the soul of Dante Alighieri had lasted almost a decade long. In his Inferno, only a weekend. But there's no doubt that his art was imitating his life. In 1302, he was exiled forever from his native city of Florence, forced to wander all over Italy, rootless, cut off from his wife, children, and friends. With Book 2, he signals a change in his frame of mind. Hope begins in the Purgatorio. It's daybreak. We're on an island with a mountain right in the center of it. Here, every feature of the landscape radiates meaning.
The first thing that we see is light. We haven't seen any light because the Inferno is darkness. So that's the first impression. And the other is perhaps the waves gently beating against the shore.
Dante scholar Amilcare Iannucci.
We're on a mountain island, the mountain of Purgatory. It's at the antipodes of Jerusalem, at the other side of the world. It's a tall mountain that reaches well into the heavens. So you can say that it's scraping the heavens. And this is rather a unique place because Purgatory, until Dante's time, had been figured as an underworld realm. Dante is the first to rip it from beneath the ground and place it in this world. So Dante really figures the Purgatorio not as an underground realm where you are purged by fire. His purgatory is one where you gradually become lighter as you are freed from the burden of sin.
Dante scholar John Ferchero.
The Inferno is dedicated to a kind of destruction, a stripping away of all of the illusions to arrive at a kind of point zero. And the Purgatory is a kind of building up from that zero to a new apex. So Inferno and Purgatorio are related to each other almost as sections, a kind of anatomical section of the moment of conversion. Conversion involves a destruction of a former sinful self and a construction of a new virtuous self.
If you were looking at the bottom of the mountain and you cast your eyes up, you would see that at a certain point there are terraces. There are 7 of those terraces which swing around the mountain where the 7 deadly sins are purged. At the top of that mountain there's a great plateau, and that is where Dante places the earthly paradise.
A climb up the mountain to the earthly paradise. That's essentially what the Purgatorio is about. Through the 7 terraces of pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust. And in the process, a conversion, a redemption takes place. Dante won't be the only one trying to purge his soul of sin.
May I see it again as it appeared to me, across the sea. A light was coming so swiftly that no flight could compare with its motion.
Dante can hardly make out that the bright light is a ship, powered by an angel, who gently places it on the water lapping the shore. As the vessel touches down, he can see that it has more than 100 souls on board. They are penitents, about to make their journey up the mountain of Purgatory. And they are singing.
And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry. and I am come down to bring them up out of that land, unto a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey.
The Purgatorio begins with the music of movement and of conversion. In exitu Israel de Aegypto, which the souls that are arriving at Purgatory sing as they disembark the ship. They are purging themselves of all sins, their disposition towards sin, because at the moment of death, they detach themselves from their sinful past. It was a conscious act of the will on their part. And because they have died in grace, time and the experience of purgatory is really preparing themselves for this rising, this liberating experience.
Psalm 113, In exitu Israel de Aegypto. The penitents sing about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, as they begin their own exodus from sin into righteousness, something Dante would have understood as the ritual of pilgrimage. John Ficero.
Purgatorio has been compared to a pilgrimage. There's a community feeling among the characters, and there is a sense, in keeping with the Exodus figure, it's clear that we have come through Inferno, which is a kind of Egypt. We have crossed a body of water, a sea of rushes, which Dante knew was the real name of the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds. In the first canto, Virgil plucks a reed and ties it around Dante's waist. There are commentators on the poem who think that the Mount of Purgatory was meant to look like Mount Sinai, that Dante was imagining a kind of pedagogic Mount Sinai set out for a bunch of pilgrims with way stations en route in order to recall important moments of the faith to the minds and hearts of the faithful. And that indignation that he has in the beginning of hell seems gradually refined away to the point where, instead of thinking of his exile as a monstrous injustice visited on him by his enemies, he comes to see exile as the manifestation in his own life of the paradigm of Exodus, which all Christians and Jews must eventually, in some way, metaphoric or not, face during their lives. We are all exiles.
Translator of the Purgatorio, William Merwin.
He is the first person singular telling the story, but as he does it, he makes himself every man. He makes himself represent the human soul, the earthbound mortal. And that's very important because Dante is very much aware of his weight as a human being, actual physical weight. That's the weight of mortality. Time is very important in the Purgatorio, the sense of time. He tells you all the time what hour of the day it is, not only where they're standing, but in Jerusalem and in other parts of the earth, and the places where they've come from. The earth is turning in time, which is, of course, the hours of the day, the hours of light. All of that is passing, it's changing before one. And the reality of the Purgatorio is a sense of loss. And the basic metaphor is extremely deeply rooted and profound, in which death is life and life is death. They become aspects of each other.
According to the Church, Purgatory was located inside the earth, where flames purified the sinners. Dante's originality was to remove it from the underworld and relocate it in time and space. As he stands on the shore of the island of Purgatory, Dante begins to see that his personal history, his exile from Florence and his endless wandering, comprise only one part of a larger universal story. And the wonder of it is that it all takes place while he's alive, and the rest of the souls crowding around him are dead.
I saw one rush ahead of the rest of them to embrace me with so much affection that he moved me to do the same. Oh, shadows that, except to the eye, are vain.